Very welcome back. So yesterday in The Athletic, an article was published, the headline of which said abusive and belittling or a woman being direct. Vera Pauw at the Houston Dash, and it has reopened a conversation which started here in December about Vera Pauw and her conduct at Houston. I'm very happy to say the two journalists behind this piece in The Athletic have made time to join us this evening. Sarah Shephard is with us on the line. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having us.
No, thank you very much. And Steph Yang as well. Hi, Steph.
Hello from the United States.
Great to have you with us. So I'm sure a huge amount of work went into this piece, Sarah. You might just give us a sense of how it came about, because I've seen, for instance, the point being made on Twitter that, is there a degree of opportunism here right on the eve of a World Cup? Am I right in saying that Vera Pauw actually approached The Athletic and asked for a look into how not players can be protected by coaches or from coaches, but coaches could be protected from players? Was that what instigated your work on this piece, Sarah?
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't something that was on our agenda or on our scheduling or in our thinking at all. I got in touch with Vera in April, sending her a survey that we are doing into women's football. And obviously, her having been involved in the game for such a long time, I thought it would be useful to get her thoughts. And she filled out the survey and she replied, and she said, that's when she said to me, when do you start thinking about the double standards and protecting coaches from players as well as players from coaches? And obviously that sparked a conversation between the two of us. And I said, would you be interested in doing an interview about this? And she was keen. I then did not want to do that interview without obviously revisiting what happened in Houston, because I thought it was important to be fully up to speed on that. And then obviously looped in with my colleague Steph, who's in the States and is obviously much closer to that situation than I am, and then the ball really got rolling from there. So it was very unusual, I suppose, the way it happened, and sparked by Vera coming to us initially.
Yes, and as the reason I read out the headline of your piece, Steph, is that it makes it pretty clear from the off that this piece doesn't reach a hard and clear verdict. It presents views from players and coaches, and Vera's response. Vera Pauw in the Irish media, and it seems with yourselves as well, has been very keen to clear her name, to deny all the allegations, to engage with the media in a very strong way. So it sounds like she did that in this instance too.
Well, I would say anyone reading the piece, I think we laid it out pretty factually. We talked to 7 former staff and players in Houston. Obviously, Vera has her side. She strongly denied the allegations, and we, published her comments as well. I would just encourage people to read it, and this is something we've been dealing with in the United States for a while, and it's a question that has come up in these investigations as well. Are there two sides to the story? Technically, yes, there are two sides to the story, but I encourage people reading it to think about, what do these people have to gain by coming forward all these years after the fact? Some of them are not in soccer anymore. Some of them are. They're in many different stages of life. They're both on the staff and on the player side. And as we've seen, people are now questioning, their motives. Obviously, they're anonymous, but there's so little reward in coming forward, and everything to lose in doing so, in my opinion. So, yes, I think that we had to lay out that there were two perceptions of what happened. But, I do think that background context is important to consider when thinking about why people would want to come forward.
Well, on that issue, and I can't speak for those players or those coaches who have come forward, Vera Pauw in the piece said it was the players who created a hostile environment for her, and that these claims are the result of, quote, an agenda from a small group. So she says they have an agenda. Sarah, could I ask you, the 7 players, staff that you spoke to, I just on the methodology, because it's maybe important. For instance, and you mention it in your piece, and it's a very fair piece. You give all the angles right the way through. You do note, for instance, that Pauw has statements and provided statements from 12 former players and assistants across her time in Scotland, the Netherlands, South Africa, and Houston, all supporting her work. And 2 of those statements were from former Dash players, and they were seen by the Athletic, and they had comments such as, "You really care about individuals, and that's more than I've had in a coach in a long time." So I suppose in terms of the pair of you having to decide what's fair, you have 4 players, 3 coaches, generally very, very negative about Pauw, and she's provided 12 statements, and there's that brief quote there. Did you try and speak to every player from 2018 in Houston? Because you might have 4 players, 3 coaches who were unhappy, and I'm not saying there's not a validity to what they have to say, but you could have 25 on the other side of the ledger who are of a similar mindset to the person who says you really care about individuals, and that's more than I've had in a coach in a very long time. Did you try and speak to everyone and give us a sense of the methodology maybe as to how you arrive at these 7? Because they obviously have a big weighting in this piece.
Sure. It was Steph who approached the players, but
you can take it, Steph, if you want, if that makes more sense. If it was you who tried to source the players, Steph, by all means.
Sure. Yes, I spoke to players, and then, as is often the case in investigations like these, people are very hesitant to speak. They don't know you. They don't know your motivations. So you talk to one person, and then you say, "Can I speak to somebody else?" And then, you hear, "Oh, this person might be willing to speak to you." That sort of, you kind of follow a chain from 1 or 2 initial people who are willing to speak, and then they vouch for you and say, like, "Yes, I spoke to this person and she didn't burn me, so she's not going to blast your identity for everybody to see." It's not possible to speak to everybody. For example, one of the players who was spoken about by her teammates is not in a position to receive questions about what went on just due to her own mental health and her emotional well-being. It was advised, several times, like, do not contact this player about this topic because it will create, a setback in her ongoing recovery from what happened during that time period, whether or not it was related to Vera. So that sort of thing. You talk to as many people as you can in the time limit that you have.
Yeah.
This is obviously something we didn't want going on during the World Cup, just for the players' sake. We wanted to wrap it up in time for people to at least have some time to process before they're, in country and preparing for the tournament. And when we're trying to weigh testimonies against each other, I don't think it's helpful to consider it in terms of sheer numbers, because let's suppose, a coach treated 99 people well, but treated one person like absolute, I don't know if I'm allowed to use a swear on this show.
I take the point. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that okay if they, treat 99 people well, but they treat one person so badly that this person has, emotional breakdown? I think it's not necessarily helpful to weigh numbers that way, but to consider what harm was caused.
I think the piece does also make clear that it wasn't a complete 100% of the players were against her. The piece does make clear that there were players who did get on with her. Janine Van Week, who came out last year in full support of Vera Pauw, is obviously one of those.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a situation where the whole team was feeling the same way.
Yes, I take that point absolutely, and I'm not here to criticize the piece, and I most certainly wasn't in that Houston dressing room. I suppose I'm just curious, journalist to journalist, for instance, did you consider it was worth giving an 8th or 9th player who is pro Pauw more time in the piece to give their perspective on certain instances? Because I suppose my frustration as a reader is that we have, I suppose, a theme throughout the piece of one of the staff or one of the players saying, this happened, and we have Vera Pauw saying, it absolutely did not happen. And it's a fairly regular occurrence throughout the piece. And And I suppose you're just crying out for some kind of arbiter or somebody to say, well, I'm somewhere in the middle. I thought she was okay. Here's what I made of that. We don't quite get that. Hence, I think it might have been interesting to have another couple of players who maybe were pro-Pauw to give their perspective on what some of the complainants were talking about. Because I think there probably is a degree of, if you speak to the initial person and they have a grievance with Pauw, then they're more likely to recommend somebody else who also had a grievance. But I take your point, Steph. 99%, does that mean we forget about the 1%? It doesn't. I suppose I'm just struggling to get the overall picture in that dressing room when it came to their sense of Pauw. Because I think when I spoke to all 7, there was a pretty unified sense of what had happened. Not that they all said the same thing, but the things they all said resonated in the same way. And obviously we didn't include anything that hadn't been corroborated by more than one source. Yeah. And these are people who haven't seen each other or spoken to each other sometimes in years. And so when I contacted them, some of them out of the blue, and they spoke to me, I think that is instructive to say that at least 2 or more people perceived the situation the same way, or when obviously memory's fuzzy. That did come up where this is 2018 we're talking about. And so, we were very encouraging, or at least I was very encouraging to say, if you don't recall correctly, or if you can't recall clearly, I want you to say that, because I think it's really important to not get into fuzzy areas. Be very honest about what you can and can't recall and what you do and don't have records about. But we did, corroborate things between sources who, had no reason to suspect I was going to call them up and ruin their week, essentially. Okay. So look, that's enough on the methodology, and you've explained how you went about it. And I think people have a good sense of that. To maybe pick our way through some of the key points in the piece, it starts off, I suppose, again, by setting up this dichotomy which I referenced. So, for instance, you've quotes from several of the players' coaches. I was miserable. Another year like that, I wouldn't be playing pro soccer. We were afraid of her. Somebody else said, everybody has their own coaching style. I get it. But it was, in my opinion, abusive and inappropriate, belittling and doing it in such a public manner. And right next to that, we have Vera Pauw saying it was the players who created a hostile environment for her, and these claims were the result of an agenda from a small group. And she said as well, I'm Dutch, so I'm clear on what I want, and I think the fact that I may be different, that is what they have felt. They are not used to women being direct. So, Sarah, that's a kind of, in overall terms, that's a regular theme that I've outlined there throughout the piece.
Yeah, and that was very much Vera's, Vera's feeling, and that's very much still her feeling now, that a lot of these things wouldn't have been raised against her had she been a male coach. That was something that she repeated throughout the time that I spoke to her. She just couldn't understand how some of these things were even issues, and said that if she had been a male coach, it wouldn't have been an issue at all. And that is something that she, together with her attorney, Thomas Newkirk, has been working on perhaps bringing a case against the NWSL if the NWSL don't reopen the investigation, because they believe it wasn't conducted as well as it could be, and that it was affected by gender bias. So that was very much her feeling, and in all of these situations, in many of the situations, not in all of them, she felt that she was basically called out because she was a woman. A lot of these things were only issues because she was a woman, and maybe she didn't behave in the way that some people expected her to behave as a woman.
The issue of weight is a significant one, Steph. Vera Pauw absolutely argues and defends herself that she should have a say in players' fitness. She's a coach. There's an account of one player in particular who lost weight, and it was getting to the point of not healthy in the eyes of one player, and she ended up quitting. Pauw denies ever praising that player for her weight loss. Could you give us your sense of what was going on when it came to the weight of the players, Pauw's interaction with the players, and where that line is, or where they think it was crossed? Pauw herself references Pep Guardiola, for instance, talking very publicly about Calvin Phillips's weight, and the point being it's absolutely something every coach in history is allowed to be a touch preoccupied with. So you might give us your sense from both sides there, if you could.
Sure. My sense was that the players were really coming from a place of concern. They were seeing their teammate develop, in their opinion, unhealthy habits around exercise and food that were unrelated to her performance on the field. They, saw that it was getting to what they perceived to be a almost dangerous level, where, they were linking Vera, praising her, saying, "You look good." But this is a comment that they were hearing that was not related to her actual metrics on the field, which should be more about, are you hitting certain targets passing or making runs in the right areas? And then, there are general links, I guess, between weight and speed. Maybe if you're lighter, you accelerate faster. But there are ways of talking to players about performance that don't focus so much on the body. This is something that we see, she brings up Pep. I think it's important to note this happens in the men's game as well, where men develop issues around their bodies and how they look, in the mirror, regardless of performance, due to comments about, weight or an approach that was taken that wasn't necessarily the right approach that links in the player's mind, the right elements of what they need to be focusing on in order to improve their performance. And I want to note, this is something that other people in NWSL have been criticized for, including male coaches. Very publicly, there was a report done as a joint investigation between the league and the NWSL Players Association. It was run by law firm Covington and Burling. And in that report, which is public, they do note that Fareed Ben-Stidi, who was the coach of OL Reign over in Seattle, had also made comments about players' weights and food and telling them don't snack and that sort of thing. And this was something that he got in pretty serious trouble for and was let go by the club afterwards. So, I think it's a recurring problem. I think if you talk to any coach who's been in the game for a while at almost any level, they'll say, yes, this is something that we have to be aware of and how we approach players, male or female, in talking about their bodies.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people, I don't know the instance, by the way, you're referring to, but they ease off on the snacking line. I suspect a lot of people would look at a dressing room and say, well, a coach is perfectly entitled to say that. And that, Sarah, maybe raises this kind of strange dynamic with a locker room, with a football dressing room. I think generally HR rules don't apply, and maybe this is the beginnings of a HR landscape getting involved in football dressing rooms, because Pauw, in her conversation for the piece, is adamant she's entitled to talk about their fitness, but all she did was talk about their fitness, and of course weight is, fairly or otherwise, it is a part of that.
Yeah. But it raises really interesting questions about, where the line is, and also about the mental well-being of elite athletes. Maybe in the past we haven't considered that so much. We've put success, we've put other things above the mental well-being of top athletes. And is that really the right thing to do? Maybe viewpoints need to change. There is a really interesting piece to be done, and perhaps might be one of the follow-ups that we do, looking at whether you do need to speak to female athletes differently than male athletes when it comes to issues around eating, because there are, I've spoken to a few people about this, psychologists especially, and there are very valid reasons for saying that yes, not in all cases, that there are male players who will be on the same sort of spectrum. But in many cases, yes, you do need to approach the topic differently with female players than male players. It doesn't mean that you don't approach it or that you ignore it, because like you said, it's a valid kind of piece of coaching. It's necessary for some coaches. It just means you have to be more aware of how you're doing it, and perhaps involve other people who are more expert in terms of like when you're actually doing it. So it raises a lot of interesting questions that, you know, wasn't possible to answer within this piece, but obviously could be answered in follow-up pieces.
Yeah, maybe we saw the conflict there borne out. I have to take apologies. I have to take a very short break, but if you don't mind, Sarah and Steph, we might just continue the conversation on the far side. Sarah Shephard, Steph Yang with us, talking about their piece in The Athletic. Now, you're very welcome back. We're continuing the conversation with Sarah Shephard and Steph Yang, who've written a piece in The Athletic about Vera Pauw's time at Houston in 2018. Steph, an area which was teased out in the piece, which wasn't as to the fore in December's report, was physical aggression. So, for instance, I'll just read from your piece. There were 2 instances when players claim Pauw's behaviour turned physically aggressive. Several witnesses, both staff and players, say they saw Pauw grab a staffer around the neck or collarbone area and shove her at half-time of an away game early in the season. Now, Pauw denies this, refutes this. She says that 2 players were, quote, verbally exploding and a staff member wanted to intervene, and Pauw says, I stopped her, I said, stop, sit down, calm down everybody. She says, that's my job. I never pulled the collar. I maybe put a hand on the shoulder. It is absolutely untrue to say it in this way, the way that it was said initially. And then another example, for instance, staffer A, who was in the locker room at the time, said Pauw saw a coach giving advice to another player, and so the quote is, she runs at her, yanks her back, tells her to shut up and says, I'm the only coach of this team. And staff Ray says, it was not like a friendly hand on the shoulder of this coach or a pat, it was aggressive. Said player C, who also witnessed it. It's a high intensity environment, but Pauw's touch was not just intensity, it was aggression. Again, Pauw, and I stress this in the most adamant terms I can give you, denies this, absolutely denies physical aggression. So she's never been aggressive, not even as a child, is a line she uses. So again, Steph, we're back from the reader's point of view to that unsatisfactory space whereby Pauw is absolutely adamant and the account of the players and the coaches adamant as well.
I think it's, perfectly reasonable for Vera to completely believe the truth of what she's saying. I'm not going to say that she's lying, because for her, this could absolutely be the truth to her of how she perceived the incident. I think that's actually pretty common when we think about, legal testimony and things like that. People will testify to something that they saw, and to them, that is exactly how it played out. To them, they are objectively telling the truth of what they experienced. And I don't want to gainsay someone's experience of a situation, because it was their experience of the situation, right? But we have corroborated testimony from others who saw it differently. And when you have multiple people saying the same thing about how they saw an incident, maybe it varies in, the intensity with which they regarded it. That does come back to everyone kind of interprets things, a little bit through their own lens. So if people are used to a very intense and aggressive locker room because they've come from an aggressive program, maybe they look at that and they say, oh, it was pretty intense, but it wasn't that aggressive. But someone who's come from a more calm program or somewhere where, maybe they had a vibe that was more soft-spoken or something, they see that as very intense and aggressive. Again, it was multiple sources corroborating, a story between them, and seeing that she had, alleging that she had placed a hand around, the neck or the collar area and, told the coach, like, you don't coach here, I coach, I'm the only coach. I think that was also a pretty common thread that ran across multiple staffers and players, staffers in different departments as well. Her insistence that nobody coached or gave instruction except her, and that seemed to match up very well between multiple parties.
Yes. Sarah, on parking the physical aggression point, on the control point, it's funny, I suppose Alex Ferguson, being the most famous manager of the last 30 years in this part of the world, if you ask Alex Ferguson what's the most important aspect of being a manager, in a one word he says every time, control. And Vera Pauw is unashamed, I would say, is my reading, in exerting total control over everything. She sees it as her job. I don't know if she should make apologies for wanting to be in total control of a team she's in charge of. Again, that's looking at it through her lens, but I do understand that lens.
She didn't actually. She denied some of the control issues, especially around not letting players visit the pool, etc.
Yes.
She said she denied some of that. She said they're allowed to do what they like on weekends, etc. She said with the Irish team, their weekends are their own when they're in camp, and she doesn't keep on top of what they're doing. So she didn't totally kind of go along with that. But in terms of some of the other things, yes, she did say, it's my job as a coach to be across, that they're getting enough food, that they are fueling themselves correctly, that they are not overtraining. She said she didn't want players doing extra because she felt what she was programming for them was enough. And yes, she sees that as her role, as, like you said, as many coaches would. But there is this line that is very hard to say exactly what it is or where it is, but there is a line, and obviously some of these players felt that it went over that line and that they were being overly controlled and overly managed to the point where they didn't feel they could do things that they should be free to do as adults. And so it's very difficult. We can't say, who's right and who's wrong. It's that was the player's perception, whereas Vera's perception was that she was doing her job, and that's what she does. Yes,
no, I understand the difficulties. Just a slightly surreal moment in the midst of the piece that we should just touch on briefly is that Vera Pauw says she was on the receiving end of a death threat. So she said she received a death threat, and it's here where she's talking about her general unhappiness with the culture at times in Houston. A death threat from a member of staff who was angered by her decision, you write in the piece, to move training sessions from morning to the evening to avoid players training in the heat of the day. He threatened to shoot me in the head as I was taking his beer night away, said Pauw. Now, Pauw said she received police protection until that matter was resolved, and you reached out to the former Houston Dash president, Chris Kennedy, and he replied by email. And so he said the organisation took internal disciplinary actions and other steps to directly deal with the situation regarding an employee. He said as well, I am not aware of, nor do not recall any external involvement in this situation. So am I right in characterising this situation as Vera Pauw said she was given police protection, that the police deemed this situation serious enough to offer police protection, but in your correspondence with the former Houston Dash president, he has no memory of any external involvement in this situation whatsoever, so no sense of the police being involved. I don't know who wants to take that one. I'm not sure who took that end of it, but is that's about where we are in that situation?
Sure, I spoke to Chris, so I'll talk about that, which is, yes, that's a correct interpretation. Chris, as the president of the organization, would certainly have been informed if his head coach needed to have some kind of protection, whether it was police protection or, a private security agency or something around her at all times. He confirmed that an employee had been essentially let go, but didn't comment on an employment situation for their own reasons, perhaps legal. But yes, essentially saying not recalling any external involvement in the situation, meaning he was not aware of some third party having to come in and act as, protection or security detail.
And Steph, on Chris Kennedy, the president, or the management staff at large, what was their sense of what was going on in 2018? Were they aware of issues between Vera Pauw and the players in real time? Is it subsequent to that? What is their perspective on this situation?
Yes, both Chris Kennedy and then Brian Ching, who was the general manager of the team at the time, were both aware of, having to at least facilitate conversations between Vera Pauw and the players, trying to, smooth things over. I would say facilitate communication is probably the way that they would frame it. So yes, and then obviously Chris Kennedy told us, and we included it in the article, that To the best of his knowledge, of course, Vera was aware of, not every player was happy with her during the season because he'd spoken to her about it. So.
Okay. Am I right? I'm presuming, I may be wrong. Sarah, did you interview Vera Pauw for the interview?
Yes.
Could you give us a sense of her demeanor, anything that struck you in that conversation with her? I get the sense it was a lengthy one.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. I mean, we had two conversations. The first one where I basically told her of what we'd found. And in that conversation, throughout the whole thing, she was very calm, very composed. The first time I spoke to her, she sounded exasperated at the end of her tether with it. I think that's fair to say. The second time I spoke to her, which was to go through the full right of replies, as we term it, that was a 2-hour long video call with her. There were times when she, not emotional, but you could see that it had got to her bits of it. She had made notes on various parts because she said it's emotional. But she remained mainly very composed. It's I don't know if in the same situation I would be as composed when obviously she might have felt that her job was on the line or under threat. So she mostly remained very calm. I have had messages from her throughout this process. Some of them had not been quite as calm, and kind of revealed that she obviously is angered by some of this. But in the main, when I spoke to her, to me personally, she was very, very composed.
Okay. I mean, we can't go through every aspect of this piece. Ultimately, I would recommend people go onto The Athletic and read it. You've clearly all put a lot of work into it. But I mean, there's the very serious physical aggression point, Steph, and then there are times where, and again, your perspective on this would be very instructive, but to me, it almost feels, if innocuous isn't quite the right word, I'm looking for something in that vicinity, like there's a complaint from somebody that Pauw would come into the locker room when the players were changing. Pauw denies that. She says, I would always announce myself. She said quite a few of the players said to her, Vera, you're a woman, you don't need to announce yourself, and she did it anyway. And again, maybe because I'm more versed in traditional male dressing rooms in this part of the world, that wouldn't have occurred to me even as worthy of significant complaint or to fall under the heading of inappropriate. So that clearly players did have a problem with that, and Pauw, as I said, defended herself.
Yeah, in NWSL, at least, most of these players are accustomed to a locker room situation where it's practice for the coach to knock and ask essentially everybody decent, can I come in? When players are changing or showering, it's it becomes more of a private player only space, as you could imagine. And a locker room is a place where I think players also kind of want to feel they can emotionally decompress as well before and after a game. And so, having your coach, your boss, the person who controls your playing time and that sort of thing in and out of there felt intrusive or awkward. A lot of players phrased it as, at the very least, it was awkward. And yeah, they felt it was intrusive. And I think just because it might be considered a standard in one place, very clearly in this place, they felt it should not be the standard. And so when it deals with their autonomy and privacy and ability to feel like they're not being monitored, I think that's a pretty fair request. That's one of the things that I think you've touched on here is, that's a standard. I wouldn't have thought about that. But maybe the deeper question is, well, why wasn't it the standard? Why didn't we think about that? Just because it's the way things have been done,
yes,
doesn't mean that it's the right way to do things.
Yes, no, I take that point entirely. I'm just curious for your perspective, because it's something I've mentioned on the show earlier on as I think being troublesome, and I'd be curious for an outsider's view. In effect, what happened here in Ireland is the report was published in December, and that same evening, within a couple of hours, the Football Association of Ireland issued a statement fully supportive of Vera Pauw, had no reason to disbelieve her, said she had denied the allegations, and it was very much full steam ahead to the World Cup. It's been a similar reaction to your piece. As I understand it, I know Vera Pauw had a conversation with the captain, Katie McCabe, to check, is there anything I'm doing? And Katie said no. But in so much as I can ascertain, there was no third-party conversation with all the players to check that they're happy with how things are being done. There was no third-party investigation. It was just very much a case of Vera Pauw has denied these allegations and we press on. Steph, what do you make of how the Football Association of Ireland have handled this case?
I think you have hit the nail on the head in that if there's no third party involvement, there is a little asterisk on things. One thing that has come out in the multiple investigations that have gone on in the United States, at least in NWSL, is that a key recommendation is that there is a third party, some kind of neutral oversight body where players can anonymously report complaints, because obviously in any workplace, if your boss comes to you and says, am I doing anything wrong?
Yeah.
What are the odds you're going to go, well, boss, let me tell you about what you did, that sort of thing. Perhaps the players did feel comfortable, and perhaps everything is very good in Ireland camp. I think it's instructive that national team camp is very different from a club situation. You have your players in usually 2-3 weeks at a time. Maybe it's more feasible to oversee things in a more detailed way in that time frame, as opposed to a club where every single day for a year you have to be hip deep in every single detail. So obviously we can't see into the Ireland camp, and obviously it would be great if the players were happy and healthy and safe. You want to wish that secretly behind the scenes, things are awful. I'm hoping they have a fantastic World Cup. So yeah, I think that when I hear that there was no third party involvement, it does signal a little like, oh, perhaps that's a process that the Federation should look at, not just for Vera, but in general for the long-term health of their own program. It doesn't just protect the players. If we're talking about protecting coaches, it protects you, the coaches in the Federation as well.
Yes, I mean, a third-party investigation, I'm sure Vera Pauw would tell us, would completely exonerate her and her work with Ireland. Sarah, your perspective on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Steph. And obviously, the Irish FA are fully focused on what's coming up, what's right around the corner. And I can understand from their point of view that they perhaps don't want to look that way right now. They only want to look that way. But you just worry, we know we've seen various things play out in other sports, in other situations where down the line, that kind of attitude can come back to bite you on the proverbial. So it's an understandable attitude, but maybe a little bit of a short-sighted one.
Yes. And because I know, I've seen the text messages, I know there will be responses. As a final thought, as we try and kind of knit together this pretty complicated picture, I know there will be a sense from a lot of the Irish public, well, hang on here, where's the smoking gun? What is the issue? This is a manager managing, doing it in a very full-on way. But I mean, she has to be able to do her job, and it's a tough world, and it's pro sport, and what's more, she denies the more serious end of the allegations. And where is the issue? And she is being vilified unfairly here by just a few voices, and they're ringing very loudly, and it's deeply affecting a coach's career. Steph, what's your response to that sentiment, which I suspect is out there?
I would say first, I would ask people, how many voices does it take before something, becomes, in your mind, serious or something? We see it a lot when it comes to other cases of, for example, assault. I'm absolutely not saying that what she has done is comparable to that, but just in terms of, when people find that there's some kind of gray area or something. Well, how many people does it take alleging that harm has been done to them before, it reaches some threshold where you think, okay, now it's serious and I should take it seriously? Is it 1? Is it 10? Is it 100? And then another one that I think would say is, you know, the players aren't just alleging that Vera Pauw was a coach who liked to control every aspect of her team. I come back to one of the staffers saying that the level of involvement that she was trying to have here was untenable, at least at a club situation where a staffer was saying, you can't control every single thing for every single line on the field, the forwards, the midfielders, the defenders, and the goalkeepers, or you can't do it well. And so I think that what they were trying to put across there is that it wasn't just control. It was control to a degree where, you know, a lot of the things that they were alleging, these are normally spread across 4 or 5 full-time jobs. You have an assistant coach for a reason. You have a sports scientist for a reason. You have a head athletic trainer for a reason. And I think the allegations were, you know, saying that it was just, she was trying to do all these jobs and none of them were allowed essentially to do their job on their own autonomously without going back through her. And so how good a job can one person do really when they're trying to handle all these, you know, juggle all these plates in the air? So that's kind of where I would want people to kind of maybe take that in and think about it and mull over, you know. And then as the very last thing, something that you brought up again that we've talked about multiple times is, you know, just because something's been done one way.
Yeah.
Is it the right way?
No, I hear that. I mean, on the middle point, and I give you last word, Sarah, if that's okay. Steph, sorry, I don't mean to not give you right reply. Again, bad at delegation, sure. Guilty of improper conduct is a whole other sphere, and somebody's reputation is obviously one of the most important things they have at their disposal. So, again, your response, Sarah, to people who will be critical of the article and feel, where is the smoking gun here?
I think it's interesting that a lot of responses on Twitter have criticised the anonymity of the players and coaches that we spoke to.
Yes.
Because then you could say, well, they're sort of easily dismissed then if you're only talking about player A, staffer A. You know, you don't think about these player A, staffer A as individuals and people with lives and thoughts and feelings, whereas Vera, we have speaking from the heart, speaking passionately in her defence. So it's kind of interesting that people have criticised the piece for that, where actually it might have been a stronger case had we been able to name the players, had we been able to show, you know, how they feel really, and how, you know, this has impacted them, and how people's lives have been impacted. It's a much stronger case for them, and you know, if we could do that, but obviously for various reasons we couldn't name the players. So it's I can understand some people kind of dismissing it, because that's like the attitude in sport that we've seen a lot. You know, well, this is like Steph said, this is the way it's always been done and there's nothing wrong with it. It gets results. Well, actually, is that the most important thing, or are people's, you know, mental health and well-being equally important and more important? You know, are we looking after these athletes as individuals? And there were seven people who said that wasn't the case in Houston.
Okay. Well, I thank you both very much for your time. It's much appreciated. The piece is on the Athletic website and essential reading. Sarah Shephard, Steph Yang, thank you both very much. Do appreciate it.